Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 50 of the Bill Podcast. Yes, that's right, the big 50. And in this episode, we'll be going through DOM, or rather Document Object Model, which is used for interacting with objects in HTML, XML, and other documents. So as usual, I'll start with the Wikipedia page, which will give us an overview, a very brief overview about DOM. And more importantly, if we kind of scroll down, it will also give us the history, the layout engines, and also the standardization part. So if you kind of see this little lines here, so currently we are using the DOM level 3, which was standardized and published in the year 2004. And currently DOM level 4 is being developed. But moving on from Wikipedia page, more importantly, we can look at the standardization documents itself, and that is residing in the w3.org website. And other than the specification document, you can also look at the living standard, which is found in whatwg.org. And finally, I also recommend Mozilla MDN's DOM reference documentation. So within these three websites, you'll get a very thorough documentation on what is DOM. So this is really simple. So here we will select a shape below. As you can see, the shape will change according to the click that I'm doing here. And correspondingly, if we click the color will also change. And this is completely done with the DOM libraries. No frameworks such as jQuery or Dojo or Moo tools are used. So let's get started with DOM. Here I have started the server localhost and started the live reload. And let me just split the screen. And this is completely empty as of now. So let's start right from the beginning. So I'll just make a very quick framework for the index.html page. And let me just put shapes and colors as the title. So as you can see, once I save, it will be updated here immediately. So let's get some working stuff. So for this, I will start with the style, and inside the style, I'll just include just one class for now. Let's have it as color, and maybe we can put it as medium turquoise. And finally, in the body, I will also keep it really simple. Firstly, I'll start with a header1 tag, and this will have a class of info. And I will say select a shape below. And other than the embedded styles that I have here info, I will also have some inline styles. And other than the header one, I will also very quickly have an unordered list with ID list, and I will have 4 of them. So basically, these will be the shapes: circle, square, rectangle, and oval. Great, so now we are good to go and explore some of the DOM libraries. Now before we do that, it is very essential to kind of visualize the entire DOM as a tree. And with a simple Google search, we will see many such diagrams or pictures. And each of these elements are kind of denoted as a node in the tree. And just like a family tree, it has also hierarchy in terms of parents, ancestors, siblings, descendants, or even child. So taking note of this relationship in a DOM tree, let's explore some of them. So the very first thing that we'll explore is the window. And here you will see many of the functions that are denoted here. Now within the window, we will have the document. So once again, you see in the Google Chrome browser console, it will even kind of prompt us. And once we do the document and we open up the document, there you go, the entire elements can be seen here, the head, the body, and you can collapse and expand them accordingly. So this is where all our tags and header and the unordered list resides. So of course, you can also go ahead and just query document, which will give you basically the same as window.document. Now let's query a document, because a document is a node, so we can query it as a node name. And once we do that, you notice that the node is named document. We can also query something called the node type. And this is really interesting. It will give us a number 9. So what is the number 9? Here I am referring to the documentation under MDN and node type. So here you will see various numbers here. So number 1 is the element node. Later on you will see. Number 3 is the text node. And number 9, there you go, is the document node. So now that we are a little bit clear about document being the starting node, let's try to kind of traverse through this DOM tree. So the very first node that we will try to explore is the body. And there you go, we have the body, and of course under the body we have the header 1 and UL and the live reload script. So interestingly, let's try to query the very first child of body. So just like a hierarchy, we can query the first child. So let's see what this gives us. So interestingly, this will just give us a text with a data which is a carriage return. But here we see that it is actually header 1, isn't it? Well, it is a carriage return because we are starting in a new line. But what if this header 1 is immediately after body? So let me just save this. And this time I'm going to query the same thing, and notice that it is a header 1. So every time there's a carriage return, it will come up as a node by itself. So this is something to note when we are traversing the DOM tree. So now that we know that this is the second child, why don't we go ahead and query document.body, and in this case we will do first, instead of child we'll do first element child, and there you go, you will see the header 1 coming up. Interestingly, you can also query the node itself. So why don't we query firstly the node name, and that is h1 obviously, and why don't we query a node type? So this gives us a number 1, and if we go back to the documentation, you will notice that, hey, 1 is element node. So next, let's go on and explore the unordered list. So to do this, I will similarly do the document.body.first element child, and why don't we do next sibling? So if we do next sibling, notice that it is a text node with a carriage return once again. This is because it is in a new line. So why don't we go ahead and query, instead of next sibling, why don't we query next element sibling? And yeah, this will give us the unordered list. So very similarly, if we query node name, this will give us the UL for unordered list. And if we do node type, it will give us 1, very similar to what we saw for H1. You might notice that, well, in a short document, we can kind of go, okay, first child and then the next sibling, but this is hardly efficient. What if we have a lot of nodes, which we typically do? Well, for in this case, we can do document.body, and we can basically query all the child nodes. And this will give us an array. So notice the first one is text, then we have header 1, then is text, and then the unordered list, text again, and then the script tag, which is a live reload, not included here. So in this case, since it is an array, we can very easily go and query it with the index. Index 1 for the array will give us header 1, and index 3 will give us the unordered list. Instead of querying the child nodes, we can also query it with some shortcuts. So let's say we can query the doc type, and in this case it will give us the HTML5 doc type. We can also go ahead and query the head, just like we were doing for .body. And similarly, we can also do document.title, which will give us the shapes and color right from the title tag. We can also interestingly just do URL, and that will give us localhost. And finally, we can even do last modified. And there you go, this is the last modified. Now at this point you might be wondering, hey, traversal is fine, but if I have a very huge HTML document, which we usually do, it is probably not very efficient to keep writing a lot of code. In this case, we need to query the DOM and straight away just ask for the tag name or the class name or the ID name. So let's do that. So firstly, let's try to query the header 1. So in this case, I will do document.query and then selector. And here I'll just put in H1. So notice here the H1 tag comes up immediately. Very similarly, why don't we try LI? And notice here we have 4 of them. So the list items. But here you will notice that, hey, only the first one is appearing. So do note that whenever you do a query selector, only the first instance will come up. But what if we want to get all the list items? Well, in this case, there is another Well, in this case, we can use get element by, let's say, tag name. So in this case, it is actually a plural. Notice here, elements by tag name. So once we do that, sorry, I definitely need to put in the tag name itself, which is li. And once we do that, it is an array with all the 4 items. And of course, if we want to know the specific one, let's say the second one, we pass in the index 1. And there you go, square is returned. Similarly, notice like any other node, this itself also has a node name, which is li, and it also has a node type, which is 1. And like we saw before, 1 is an element node. So this is how we can query by tag. But we can also query by, say, class name. So to do that, we will do document dot get elements by class name. So once again, notice here, this is a plural, and just like the previous tag name example, this intuitively should tell us that, hey, this will return us an array. So if we do info, notice here it will give us an array. Of course, as of now, we only have 1 item. So definitely if we try to do a node and then name, it will give us undefined because it is querying an array, not one node. So to query just one node, we will pass in the first index. And yep, it will give us h1. And lastly, after we have done by tag and class, we will do it by ID. So document.get element by ID. Now notice here the element is singular in this case, no more plural. So we can easily do list. And it will return us the first instance of the ID list. Often when we first learn what is a class and an ID, we learn that the difference is, hey, if there is an ID, we should only have it like once in the same page. This is one of the reasons why we should definitely do it, because notice that this is a singular and it will only return the first instance, because if we have a second one, let's say with an ID, and let's say here we have, say, fruits. So now we have 2 unordered lists. And if we query document.getElement by ID, notice that only the first instance with the shape will be returned. So do note that whenever you are having an ID, have only 1 instance of them in the page. So let's move on to the attributes this time. Attributes in this case are some properties that are added after the tag name. So class, style, an image might have source, src, an anchor tag might have href, and so on and so forth. So firstly, let's query the h1 where I have added in some attributes. So here we will once again do a query selector and we will do h1. Alright, so that looks familiar. And next we will get attributes. And in this case, we will pass on the attribute name. So let's say class. And there you go, it will tell us that, hey, the value is info. Next, why don't we try to get the attribute ID for the unordered list? So query selector in this case will be ul. And it will tell us immediately, hey, the value of ID in this case is list. So that's about how we can query a certain attribute. Next, why don't we try to set the attribute? So let's once again do document.query selector, and I will put in header 1 once again. And this time I will do set attribute. So let me pass on class once again, but this time I will add on a class of warning. Notice here how immediately the color changed, because it is no more class info, but it is class warning, which I have obviously not styled. And now when I try to query it, so get attribute class, it will give me warning. Now obviously the original document will still say info. If you want to see the changes, let's come to the element tab, the body, and yep, here you will see class is warning. Let's go back to the console, and this time let's try to remove the class. So once again, I will do document.query selector, and this time instead of getting or setting an attribute, I'll simply say remove attribute class. So now when I try to get class, it will be null, which means there are none. And of course, if I come back to the Elements tab, notice that there is no attribute class, only the style attribute remains. Great, so that was a little bit about getting, setting, and removing attributes, and this can be expanded to literally any attributes for the tags. Lastly, we will also check if a certain attribute exists. So for this case, once again, it will be query selector. Why don't we do the unordered list this time? And let's just check whether it has the attribute. Say ID. Obviously it has an attribute ID, so it will say true. But if we want to query whether it has an attribute class, it should give us false, and yep, it does. Next, let's try to create some elements which are not found in the DOM tree initially. So let's try to insert in a paragraph. So notice here my body only has header 1 and unordered list. So let me try to create a paragraph, and then document.create element, and this time we will create a simple paragraph with a p tag. Great, and once we query para, it will give us the tag here. Next, let's try to insert in some text within this paragraph. So what I'll do is para dot, this time we'll do a text content. And let's try to put in something. Hello world. Great. And now when I query para, it will give us the tag with the inserted text. Now this is all good, but this is residing outside the DOM tree. It is not yet attached to the document. So in order to attach it, we'll do document.body because we want to attach it to the body. And then we will do append child, and inside the brackets we will pass in para. Hello world is attached to the body. Of course, as you see, the original document is not changed, but if we go to the elements tab and we scroll down, there you go, the p tag is attached right at the end. It is even after the live reload script. So that was how we can attach it, or rather append it, and it will come up as the very last child. Now what if you want it to come up right at the start? So in this case, we will once again do document.body, and if we want it to appear as the very first thing, we will do insert before. So basically here we will pass in what we want to insert, which is para for our case, and we also have to say we need to insert it before which element. So for this it will be document.body.query selector, and we will insert it before the header 1 right here. So let's try to select it, query selector, and let's do H1. And notice what happens when I press enter. Oops, para is not defined. So let me just go ahead and create it once again. And I will also add in the text content. And now let me go ahead and insert before H1. And once that happens, notice the hello world appears right at the start. So that was a little bit about querying the DOM tree, or even creating some elements and attaching it to the DOM tree in the position that we want. How about some styles now? So as you can see, we have some styles here. We have some embedded styles, no external style sheet. So one, we have embedded styles, and secondly, we have inline styles. So I'm going to create a variable and this time call it header, and this will simply be the header1 tag. So query selector, and this will simply be h1. Let's try to query it. Header.style is how we can query it. But notice here it will only give us the inline styles. In this case, it will give us the text align. But what about this color, this turquoise, or rather medium turquoise color? Well, in order to get that, we need to do window.getComputedStyle. And let's pass in the header variable that we created, and then a dot color. And in this case, there you go, it will give us the RGB color. In this case, this is the medium turquoise color. So this is how you can check both the inline styles as well as the computed, the final styles that are applied. Finally, before we get started with our project, just a little bit on document fragments. This is basically a fragment, which is a DOM-like structure, but it is not attached to the DOM. It lives in the memory external to our live DOM. So let's go ahead and create that. So firstly, I'll create a fragment, and for this, we'll say document.create document fragment. And of course, for now, fragment will be completely empty with just as document fragment. So let me just create another unordered list, and we will use the very familiar function that we learned, create element, and we will pass in unordered list. So basically this fragment that we are creating, we will try to have an unordered list of, say, colors. And now we will append this child. So fragment, append child, and then the unordered list, the variable. Great. So for this, if we query fragment now, it will be a document fragment, but if you open up, there you go, the unordered list is there. Now inside unordered list, we will append some list items. So we will start with an array of colors, and then we will do for each of them. Let's open up a function. We will do var list item document.create element once again, and this time we will create a list item, and for each of the list item we will add in a text, and here we will pass in each of the array items, which is E in our case, and next we will append it to the unordered list that we created. Oops, looks like I have wrongly named the variable. It should be just li. Great. So now once this is done, all we need to do is query frag once again. And yep, this is a document fragment, and inside that we have an unordered list. Now how do we attach or append this unordered list to our live DOM? So just like before, we will do document.body.append child and then frag. And once we do that, notice that our color unordered list will be appended as the last child. Great, so that was a little bit about libraries in the DOM. So why don't we go ahead and create our little project with all the functions and libraries that we learned. The very first thing we will do is, now that the little structure is done, is I'm going to write some code inside the script tag. And this is where I will write in all the DOM libraries. So the very first thing we'll do is I'll have a variable called shape, and before I do that, I'll just create a div element right here. And this shape will basically do document.querySelector and then have div. So basically it will query this item. Next we will have another variable, and I'll call this as a shape header. And this will be a create element. In this case, it will be a header2 tag. Alright, so before we move on, I'm going to add in some styles here right at the top. Great. So with these embedded styles, I think we are ready to go. So we will firstly add an event listener for clicks. So when we click these shapes, something happens. So for this, we will do document.say get element by ID, and here I will query list as the ID. And for this list, I will add an event listener, and I'll say, hey, the event listener is click, and then I have a function with the parameter as event. And inside the function, I'll first create a variable. So let's call it shape name, and this will be simply event.target.text content. So basically, whatever you click, that should be stored in the variable shape name. Why don't we do a simple console log and check whether whatever we are doing so far is good. And let me just click oval. Looks like it is outputting as console log the shape name. So circle a few times, rectangle 2 times, oval. Great. So looks like the shape name is good. So I'm going to comment it out. Next, I'm going to basically insert in the shape right here. And I'm going to do that by adding in the class name to this tag called div. So to do that, I'll simply do shape dot set attribute, because I will be creating an attribute, and in this case the attribute is class, and the class will be exactly the same as the shape name. So basically these will become the class names that we have kind of styled right here. Alright, so this looks good to me. Why don't we test it out? So oval, wow, looks like it's working. Square and a circle, great. So after this, why don't we also add in the shape header, which is basically, hey, I am the shape name. So to do that, we will simply do shape header dot inner text this time, and then we will define the inner text as I am plus the shape name. And of course this is not enough, we will need to append this. So we will do shape.append child and simply shape header. Great, so why don't we test this out? So now when I click oval, there you go, I am oval, I'm rectangle, I'm square, I'm circle. Great. Now as a last bit, we will also try to change the color of these shapes that we are creating. So to do this, we will insert in an unordered list of the color names. And we will basically create this unordered list as a document fragment. So firstly, I'll come up right at the top and create a document fragment variable. So let's just call it a docfrag. And this will be document.create document fragment. And with an unordered list, we'll do document.create element, and we'll create an unordered list. Next, we will also give this newly created unordered list an attribute, and we will give it an ID with the value called colors. Great. With this intact, let me just have an array of all the colors like so. Some of the CSS colors that I love to work with. And then for each of them, I'll pass in a function. And inside the function, I'll once again create a list item. So this will basically be document.create element. And each of this list item will basically have a text which is same as the clicked one. And finally, we will append this to the unordered list. And of course, most importantly, I will attach this unordered list to the document fragment. Now notice here, after we have created the shape, we will once again have another click event. So upon clicking the color, we will also change the style, which is the background color. So for this, I will once again do get element by ID, and this time it will be colors dot add event listener, and it will be click once again. And the second parameter will be an inline function. So first, let's create a variable for color name, which is basically whatever we are clicking and the text content of it. Why don't we go ahead and console log the color name? Oops, so there is a little error. So let's see, line 41. Of course, this should be a pending child as the list item. Great, so let's test it out. So there you go, it's oval, rectangle, looks like it is not adding in this list. And yes, once we click it for the first time to make the shape appear, immediately we should also kind of append the document fragment. So we'll do shape.append child and then the document fragment. Right, so let's test it out once again. So we have oval, and there you go, all the colors are there. And once I click the color, yep, it is console logging it. And finally, of course, we have to change the background color itself. So to do that, we'll do shape.style.set property. And in this case, the property will be simply background color. And what will be the color? It will be the variable color name. So why don't we test it out in the full screen? So the oval is there. It looks like the color is changing, but we need a little bit of gap in between the list items. So let me go right up, and yes, I have a little spelling here. Margin should be 30 pixel to the right. Let's try it once again. Yep, so there is the little gap, and it's changing, square, circle, oval, and so on and so forth. So that's it about this little project. I hope it gave you a very brief overview about the various DOM functions and libraries. So next time when you need to manipulate the DOM elements or even add in some events or change some styles, you have the option of either going through an abstraction library such as jQuery and others, or if it's a very simple one, you can write out with the DOM libraries itself. So let's move on very briefly to some of the links related to learning DOM or Document Object Model. I found these two books. The first one is slightly older, it's about 2-3 years old. It's called DOM Scripting. And the next one, DOM Enlightenment by Cody Lindley, is something that I read and I found it immensely helpful in order to understand what is going on behind many of the DOM manipulation libraries. For example, jQuery, Prototype. You also have Dojo toolkits or Moo tools. If we look through the source code of these libraries, we'll find that they are written in the DOM functions. So understanding this DOM function will give us the flexibility whether or not we want to use these frameworks, understand them better, or use the DOM libraries itself. And finally, for the build link of the episode, it goes to what are all the facts about Jeff Dean. So I'm giving a very humorous, a very funny build link of the week, and taking in the style of Chuck Norris, you should read how Jeff Dean is so powerful. So if you kind of scroll down, you'll find many hilarious ones. For example, say this one. Jeff Dean was born on 31st December 1969 at 11:48 p.m. It took him 12 minutes to implement the first counter. So in order to understand each of these jokes, it takes a little few seconds to kind of get the technological or some geeky reference to it. Well, in this case, it is obviously the Unix timestamp that kind of starts on 12 minutes before the birth date and time of Jeff Dean. So it's very funny, just for laugh and humor. I highly recommend this Jeff Dean All Facts list. So that's it for this week's episode on DOM, Document Object Model. For all other episodes of Build Podcast, do visit build-podcast.com, and you can subscribe via RSS, GitHub, iTunes, YouTube, or Vimeo to get your content for each episode. And I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.